She was 8 months pregnant, alone, locked inside a negative 50-degree freezer by the one person who had promised, in front of God and everyone they loved, to protect her forever. Her husband had a plan: $2 million in life insurance, an empty building, a locked door, and a story ready before anyone even knew she was missing. What he did not have was any idea what his wife was capable of. Because in the next 10 hours, Grace did not just survive that freezer. She delivered 2 babies alone in the dark. She kept them alive with nothing but her body heat and a refusal to stop breathing. And when the door finally opened, it was opened by the last man her husband ever wanted involved in his life, his billionaire enemy. The man Derek had betrayed, cheated, and nearly destroyed 7 years earlier. The man who had been working late 3 buildings away. The man who noticed a car with its hazard lights blinking. One small decision, one moment of choosing not to look away. And Derek Bennett's perfect crime became the beginning of his own destruction. Stay with us. Because this story is not just about what one man did to his wife. It is about what she did next. This is a story about what happens when someone tries to erase you, and you refuse to disappear. Every woman who has ever been told she was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much, this story is for you. Because Grace was none of those things. She was simply a woman who had not yet discovered how strong she really was. This story will remind you that survival is possible, that healing is real, and that the life you deserve does not end where someone else's cruelty begins.
10 hours? That is how long Grace Holloway had to keep 3 people alive inside a negative 50-degree freezer. Herself, and 2 babies not yet born. Her husband locked the door, his billionaire enemy opened it, and what happened between those 2 moments will change everything you think you know about survival, betrayal, and the kind of love that finds you only after everything else has burned away. Derek Bennett thought he had planned the perfect crime. He had the motive. He had the method. He had spent 9 months building the most elaborate lie of his life, and he had almost gotten away with it. Almost. Because Derek made one mistake. One single, catastrophic mistake that unraveled every carefully constructed plan, every rehearsed alibi, every calculated move he had made. He underestimated his wife. Grace was 8 months pregnant with twins when her husband locked her in that freezer. She was wearing a light blue maternity dress and a thin cardigan. She had no phone, no coat, no way to call for help. She had contractions beginning at minute 16, and she had a temperature dropping so fast that by hour 3, her fingers could no longer feel the cold. By hour 10, she had delivered 2 babies alone in the dark. By hour 10, all 3 of them were still breathing. This is not just a story about what Derek did. This is the story of what Grace survived, what she built from the wreckage, and the unexpected man who showed up at exactly the right moment, not to save her, but to open a door she was already fighting to reach from the inside. If someone you love has been slowly pulling you away from everyone else in your life, telling you your friends are a bad influence, telling you your family does not understand your relationship, telling you that they are the only one who truly knows you, listen carefully. That is not love. That is the first bar of a cage. This is Grace's story. And it begins, as so many devastating stories do, on a perfectly ordinary Sunday morning. The banana bread was Grace's idea of optimism. Every Sunday morning, regardless of how the week had gone, regardless of what sharp words had been exchanged on Thursday or what cold silence had filled the bedroom on Friday, Grace Holloway Bennett stood in her Connecticut kitchen and made banana bread. The ritual had started in the first year of marriage, when she still believed that warmth could fix most things if you applied it consistently enough She was 34 years old, 8 months pregnant with twins. Her ankles had been swollen since June. It was now November, and bending over to retrieve anything from a lower cabinet had become a full athletic event. She dropped her measuring cup on a Tuesday morning, watched it roll under the kitchen island, and spent a full 30 seconds calculating whether retrieval was worth the effort. It was not. She called the dog. Biscuit, a golden retriever with the problem-solving ability of a very enthusiastic toaster, immediately sat on the measuring cup. Grace stared at him. He wagged his tail. She started laughing, which made her back hurt, which made her laugh harder. And she was still laughing when Derek came downstairs in his pressed weekend shirt, looking at her the way he sometimes did, like he was observing a species he found puzzling. "What's funny?" he said, not quite a question. "Biscuit," Grace said. "He's helping." Derek looked at the dog, looked at Grace, poured himself coffee without offering her any, which she could not have anyway at this stage of pregnancy, but it would have been nice to be asked. "I have to go into the office this afternoon," Derek said. "Inventory situation." Grace nodded. Derek always had an inventory situation on Sundays. She had stopped asking about it 8 months ago. Somewhere around the same time, she had stopped asking why her best friend Claire had not been over to the house since July. She told herself she was being unfair. Derek worked hard. The pharmaceutical division he managed was under constant pressure. He was stressed. She was good at telling herself she was being unfair. From the outside, their life looked like a catalog. 4-bedroom colonial in Westport. 2 cars, both new. A nursery painted the precise shade of sage green that Grace had chosen herself. The one decision Derek had not had an opinion about: neighbors who waved from their driveways. A Christmas card list of 62 people, most of whom Grace had not spoken to in over a year. Her sister Megan called every Sunday from Denver, and Grace always took the call in the laundry room with the door closed, which she told herself was because of the better acoustics and not because Derek got a particular look on his face when Grace talked to her family for more than 10 minutes. "You seem different," Megan said that Sunday, 3 weeks before the freezer. "I'm 8 months pregnant with twins," Grace said. "I am different. I'm enormous." "Grace, Meg." A pause. "Are you happy?" Megan asked. Grace looked at the laundry room door, thought about the banana bread, thought about the measuring cup, and Biscuit sitting on it with absolute conviction, and the way she had laughed until her back hurt. "I'm fine," Grace said. This was the answer Grace always gave, not because it was true, but because she had been giving it for so long that she no longer knew what the alternative would sound like. She had met Derek at a marketing conference in Boston 6 years ago. He had been charming in the specific way that certain men are charming at professional events, attentive and decisive and funny in exactly the right moments. He had called when he said he would call. He had remembered details she mentioned in passing. He had made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like someone was paying close attention. It had taken her 2 years to understand that being watched very closely is not the same thing as being loved. The control had been gradual, so gradual that she genuinely could not identify the moment it had started. There was no single day she could point to and say, "There, that was when things changed." It was more like weather, a slow shift in pressure. The kind of change that happens so incrementally that you do not notice until you look up one day and realize the sky has been a different color for months. Derek came home that Sunday afternoon with flowers, pink roses, her favorites. He set them on the counter and kissed her temple and asked about the banana bread, and Grace felt the familiar confusion that had become the background noise of her marriage. The sweetness that made her doubt the sourness, the warmth that made her question the cold. Maybe she had been overthinking things. Maybe she was just tired and hormonal and catastrophizing. She was very good at talking herself out of her own instincts. What Grace did not know, as she arranged the pink roses in the blue vase by the kitchen window, was that her husband had increased her life insurance policy to $2 million 6 months earlier, without telling her, without asking her, and that the policy paid triple for accidental death, and that Derek had spent the past 9 months researching methods, calculating timelines, practicing his grief. She did not know any of this. She just knew the banana bread smelled good, and the roses were pink, and biscuit was finally off the measuring cup. She told herself she was fine. She almost believed it. The call came at 10:45 on a Tuesday night. Grace was in the nursery, folding tiny onesies into the dresser drawer she had lined with soft paper. She had been doing this for an hour. It was the kind of repetitive, tender task that pregnancy brain found deeply satisfying, and she had been half asleep on her feet when her phone lit up with Derek's name. "I need you to come in," he said. "Inventory situation, controlled substances audit, and the system flagged an error. I need a second set of eyes, and you're the only one I trust with the access codes." Grace looked at the stack of unfolded onesies. "Derek, it's almost 11. "I know. I'm sorry. It'll take 20 minutes. Bring no one, obviously, security protocols, and leave your phone in the car. The temperature changes in the storage area wreck the sensors. Last time someone brought one in, we lost 3 months of data." Grace had believed him. She would think about this later, in the hospital, in the dark, in the quiet hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, when the NICU machines beeped their steady rhythms. She would replay every word of that phone call and marvel at how reasonable it had all sounded, how each individual piece had been constructed to seem like the most natural thing in the world. Come alone. Leave your phone. Come at night. Tell no one. She had believed every word. Bennett Pharmaceuticals occupied a 7-story building in Stamford, 40 minutes from their house. The parking lot was empty when Grace arrived. Her heels clicked across the concrete. The November air was sharp and smelled like the cold front the weather app had been promising all week. Derek was waiting at the loading dock entrance. He looked, she thought, almost relieved to see her. He held the door. He said, "Thanks for coming. I know it's late. He said, "The storage bay is just down here." He said, "It's colder than I expected. Sorry about that." And then the metal door of the industrial freezer swung shut behind her with a sound that Grace would hear in nightmares for the rest of her life. The lock clicked. Then silence. The kind of silence that screams. The digital display on the wall read -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Grace stood very still for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and tried the handle. It did not move. She tried again. Again. The same desperate motion people make when they already know. "Derek." Her voice echoed off the steel walls. "This isn't funny." No answer. She pressed her palm flat against the frozen door. The metal burned through her thin cardigan immediately. The intercom crackled. "I'm sorry, Grace." His voice was calm, rehearsed, almost gentle. "I really am. Let me out, Derek. The babies. The life insurance pays triple for accidental death." A pause. "You were never supposed to be here this late. It was always supposed to look like you came in on your own. I had a whole other plan for February. But you found the gambling statements last week, and I could see you putting it together. So..." Grace's knees weakened. She pressed her back against the door and forced herself to stay upright. $400,000 in gambling debts. She had found the statements in the bottom of his briefcase 3 days ago, and she had not said anything yet because she was still deciding how to say it, still trying to figure out what it meant, still telling herself there was probably an explanation. There was an explanation. It just was not the one she had been hoping for. "You planned this," she whispered. The late-night call was a good touch, wasn't it? He almost sounded proud. "Every word you believed." The intercom went silent. Grace stood alone in the freezer. The lights were motion-activated. She understood this with sudden, terrible clarity. If she stopped moving, darkness would swallow everything. And in negative 50 degrees, stopping meant dying faster. She made herself think, forced her mind to work through the ice that was already forming in her lungs with every breath. She wore a light blue maternity dress, a thin cardigan, flat shoes, nothing designed for survival. Derek had suggested the dress that morning. "Wear something comfortable," he had said. "You'll be sitting in the car mostly." More lies, a trail of lies that had been leading here for 9 months. The first contraction hit at minute 7. Grace gasped. Her hand went to her belly. She was only 32 weeks pregnant. The babies needed more time. Her body did not care about more time. A body under extreme stress does not negotiate. She began to pace. Small circles, kept her muscles engaged, kept the lights on. One foot in front of the other. Her water broke at minute 16. She watched the amniotic fluid steam in the frozen air, watched it begin to freeze on the metal floor. This was really happening. "I didn't survive his fists, to die from his cowardice," she said out loud. Her voice sounded strange, echoey, desperate, but saying it made it real, made it true. "My babies are not dying in here." She removed her cardigan, wrapped it around her belly. Better the babies stay warm 10 more minutes than her. She kept moving, one foot in front of the other. A terrible dance with death in a 12 by 12 room. She pushed the terror down, locked it away. Terror was a luxury she could not afford. The contractions came every 3 minutes by hour 2. Grace had read 12 books about childbirth. She had attended a birthing class series with a very enthusiastic instructor named Barbara, who used a knitted uterus as a visual aid. She had practiced breathing exercises with Derek, timing her on his watch. Derek, who was right now driving somewhere warm and comfortable, leaving her to deliver their children alone in a steel box at negative 50 degrees. She thought about Barbara and her knitted uterus, and in spite of everything, something almost like a laugh moved through her chest. She was going to have to write a very specific review of that birthing class. The humor passed quickly. The next contraction did not. Grace squatted in the center of the freezer, not touching the walls, just using them for balance when she needed it. Her legs trembled from cold and exhaustion. Her breath came in white clouds that she counted like prayers. 1, 2, 3. As long as she could see her breath, she was alive. She thought about what she knew. Women had been giving birth for thousands of years in conditions that had no business supporting life, in fields and boats and basement shelters during bombings, in cars on the side of highways, in places that offered nothing except necessity and the absolute refusal to stop. She could do this, her body already was. The urge to push overwhelmed her at what she estimated was hour 3. Her body took over. Instinct replaced thought. She reached down with hands she could barely feel, positioned herself the way Barbara had shown on that very optimistic afternoon, and pushed. The pain was everything, searing, consuming, total. But pain meant she was alive. Pain meant her body was working. She felt the baby crown. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, Mama's got you." One more push. Emma slid into her frozen hands. Tiny, blue, silent. Terror seized Grace's heart, so completely that she forgot to breathe. She rubbed the baby's back, tiny circles, urgent, desperate, cleared the small mouth with a finger she could not feel. Come on, come on, come on. A gasp, then a cry, weak as a kitten, but a cry. Grace made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. It tore from somewhere deeper than either. Her daughter was alive. She had nothing to wrap her in except the cardigan she had already sacrificed. She took it back, wrapped Emma's tiny body, held her daughter against her chest. Skin to skin, the only warmth left in this place. "Mama's here," Grace whispered into the darkness. "Mama's got you. You're so strong, you're so perfect." But there was no time. Another contraction. Hard. Fast. The second baby was coming. Grace could not do this. Could not deliver another baby while holding the first. Could not keep one warm while birthing the second. It was physically impossible. She did it anyway. She adjusted her position, held Emma tight against her chest with one arm, felt her tiny heartbeat, her shallow breaths, the miraculous evidence of life. With her other arm, barely functioning, nearly numb to the elbow, she reached down as the second baby came. Noah arrived faster than his sister, like he had heard what Grace went through for Emma and decided to make it easier. Also tiny, also blue, also silent, Grace had no hands left. She could only hold him against her chest beside his sister and pray, "Please, not like this, not after all of this, please." Noah gasped, coughed, made a thin, reedy sound that was the most beautiful noise Grace had ever heard in her life. Alive. Both of them. Alive. Grace held her children in the frozen dark, their umbilical cords still connecting them to her body. No way to cut them. No sterile anything. Nothing in this steel box designed for human life. She held them, and she breathed, and she felt the cold winning. Felt her thoughts getting slower. Felt her body making the calculation that there was only enough warmth left for two of the three of them, and choosing, as bodies always do, to protect the smallest ones first. She looked at her watch, blurry. She blinked hard. 7:15 in the morning. She had been locked in this freezer for 10 hours. The last thing she remembered clearly was looking down at two tiny faces, eyes closed, barely breathing. Two miniature miracles that should not have been possible. "Mama tried," she whispered. "Mama fought so hard." Her eyes closed. She did not mean them to. 3 buildings away, in a parking lot that smelled like coffee and cold concrete, a man named Connor Hayes was about to make the worst decision of his professional life and the best decision of his entire existence. He was going to stop minding his own business. Connor Hayes had not planned to work past midnight. He had also not planned to cancel his engagement 6 months ago, to move into an apartment that still had no furniture in the second bedroom, or to develop the habit of staying at the office until the cleaning crew started giving him sympathetic looks. But here he was, 11:47 p.m., cold coffee, Building 3 of the Stamford office complex. 39 years old and absolutely terrible at being alone in a quiet room. His assistant's running joke was that Connor had never successfully left the office before 10 p.m. in his adult life. His response was always that the company didn't run itself. Her response was always that he had 400 employees whose entire job was to make sure it did. They were both right. He noticed the car on his way to the parking garage. Silver sedan. Hazard lights blinking weakly. The battery was almost dead. He had walked past it when he arrived at 6 that afternoon, and it was still there, still blinking, like a very polite cry for help. Connor stopped. He was a man who had built a technology company from literally nothing, who had taught himself to read spreadsheets, like other people read novels, who had an instinct for structural problems that his investors called almost supernatural. What he was not, historically, was the kind of man who stopped to investigate strange cars in parking lots at midnight. He started walking toward his own car, got in, sat there, looked at the silver sedan in his rearview mirror. Hazard lights blinking, blinking. He said something under his breath that is not appropriate for this audio format and got back out. The car had a Bennett Pharmaceuticals parking sticker. A purse on the passenger seat, a phone in the cup holder, screen lit up, with 17 missed calls and a cascade of text messages. Someone was looking for this person. Someone who knew they had not come home. Connor called building security. A bored guard answered on the fourth ring. Connor did not give him time to be bored. He used the voice he reserved for board meetings when someone was about to make a catastrophic error, and within 4 minutes, he was standing in the lobby of Bennett Pharmaceuticals with a skeptical security guard named Tom and a growing certainty that something was very wrong. Tom pulled the keycard logs. Derek Bennett checked in at 8:50 p.m. No checkout. Freezer access. Storage bay C. His car isn't in the lot, Connor said, but a woman's car is, with her phone still in it. Tom shifted his weight. She probably got a ride home. Connor looked at him. Tom picked up his keys. They found her in storage bay C. The cold air rolled out when Tom opened the door, -50 meeting 25, in a wall of condensation that briefly turned the doorway white. Connor could not see through it at first, could not see anything but fog. Then the fog cleared. A woman sat on the freezer floor, slumped against the wall. Her skin was blue-white. Her lips were purple. Her eyes were closed, and in her arms, wrapped in a small cardigan, were 2 tiny babies. Connor was moving before he had finished processing what he was seeing. He dropped to his knees, checked for a pulse, weak, barely there, but present. He looked at the babies, also cold, also blue, but alive impossibly against every law of medicine and common sense, alive. He stripped off his suit jacket, his thermal shirt, wrapped each baby, covered Grace's shoulders with what remained. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, delirious. "Please," she whispered. "Don't let them die. They're so small. Please." That prayer hit Connor somewhere he had not felt anything in a long time. "I've got them," he said. "I've got you. Stay awake. Help is coming." "He locked me in." Her voice was barely a breath. "My husband, Derek." Connor went very still. Derek Bennett. He knew that name the way you know the shape of a scar. Derek Bennett, who had been his business school classmate. Derek Bennett, who had presented Connor's software platform to investors as his own creation, who had forged Connor's signature on transfer documents, who had then filed fabricated embezzlement charges against Connor to discredit him when he tried to fight back. Derek Bennett, who had cost Connor 3 years of lawsuits and a complete rebuild from nothing. Connor had spent 14 months quietly documenting Derek's current fraud, building a civil case, waiting for the right moment. He understood, kneeling on this frozen floor with this woman's barely breathing children in his arms, that he had waited too long. That thought would not leave him for a very long time. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes. Connor stepped back and let them work. He watched them stabilize Grace, wrap the babies, move all 3 to stretchers with the focused urgency of people who already knew the odds were bad. Tom stood beside him. "Did she say her husband locked her in?" "Yes," Connor said quietly. He was already thinking about what came next. Grace woke up on day 3. White walls, beeping machines, an older woman in scrubs sitting beside the bed with the kind of steady, competent presence that Grace immediately recognized as someone who had delivered bad news professionally for decades and had learned to frame it in good news first. "Your babies are alive," Dr. Vivian Matthews said. "Both of them." Grace closed her eyes, opened them, made herself stay present. Emma was 3 pounds 2 ounces. Noah was 2 pounds 14. Both in the NICU, both critical, both breathing. Grace had severe frostbite. They had amputated 3 toes on her left foot while she was unconscious. Her hands had significant nerve damage. Her body had experienced trauma that Dr. Matthews described in clinical language that Grace suspected was a carefully moderated version of something much more alarming. She was alive. Her children were alive. Derek had been arrested within 18 hours. 3 counts of attempted murder. Bail set at $5 million. Denied. Claire arrived that afternoon, red-eyed and fierce, having driven from Boston without stopping. She sat beside Grace's bed and held her damaged hand with the careful tenderness of someone terrified of causing more pain, and Grace let her, because she was so tired of being the one who pretended nothing hurt. "It's over," Claire said. "He can't touch you now." Grace nodded. She let herself believe it. Connor visited the next morning. He arrived with 2 coffees, one of which was genuinely terrible, and Grace made the mistake of trying it and then made an expression that she was fairly certain frightened a passing nurse. "That's awful," she said. "I know," Connor said. "I've been told. I've never actually learned to make good coffee. It's a significant personal failing. It tastes like regret dissolved in warm water." That is the most accurate description anyone has ever given it. It was, she realized, the first complete and genuine laugh she had produced in approximately 8 months. It moved through her body like something unfreezing. Connor was not what Grace had expected. She had built a mental image of Derek's old enemy as someone hard and angular, driven by grievance. What she found was a man who was clearly more comfortable in a quarterly earnings meeting than a hospital room, who had arrived with terrible coffee and no idea what to say, and who sat in the chair beside her bed for 2 hours anyway because leaving seemed worse than staying. He told her about the delayed evidence, did not hide it or make excuses. He had known about Derek's fraud for 14 months. He had been building a private civil case, waiting for the right moment, and in doing so, he had possibly allowed Derek more time than he should have had. Grace listened. "You waited too long," she said. "Yes." "And you opened that door?" "Yes." "Both things are true," Grace said. Connor looked at her like she had said something more complicated than it sounded. Detective Laura Marsh visited the following day. Sharp eyes, efficient questions, the demeanor of someone who had heard a great many terrible stories and found the telling of them no less important for that. She walked Grace through everything. Keycard logs, security footage, Derek's car leaving the lot at 9:22 p.m., Derek's car returning at 1:17 p.m. the following day, 16 hours later, to quote discover that Grace was missing. He had filed the missing persons report from his car in the parking lot. He had a prepared statement about pregnancy hormones and instability and Grace's history of impulsive behavior. He had a therapist's name to cite. He had an entire narrative ready before anyone had even begun to look. "He's been building his alibi since before he locked the door," Marsh said. Grace was not surprised. This was the man who had planned her death across 9 months of dinner tables and Sunday mornings, and carefully suggested dresses. On day 5, Claire brought champagne she was not allowed to open in a hospital, but kept in Grace's room anyway as an act of optimistic defiance. The custody battle her lawyer had predicted had not materialized. Derek was in custody. The evidence was airtight. Grace held Emma's tiny hand through the isolette opening and felt, for the first time, that she could see a shape to what came next. Then Patricia Bennett posted bail. Derek's mother. Old Connecticut money, 4 decades of knowing the right people, $40 million, and a very good attorney who had found a procedural detail in the bail order that Grace's lawyer had not caught in time. Derek walked out of the courthouse at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. At 3:40 p.m., a black SUV drove slowly past the hospital entrance. Grace was in a wheelchair by the window when it happened. She did not see Derek. She did not need to. She knew his driver's car the way you know the sound of a particular footstep in a hallway. The way you know certain things in your body before your brain has finished the sentence. He knew where she was. Claire found her in the hallway 10 minutes later, both hands pressed against the wall, breathing like she had just surfaced from very deep water. "Grace." "He's out," Grace said, "and he knows where I am." The champagne stayed unopened for a very long time. The first catastrophe arrived on a Thursday morning in the form of a legal filing. Derek's attorney had petitioned for emergency custody of Emma and Noah on the grounds that Grace was experiencing postpartum psychosis that had been exacerbated by what the filing called a traumatic delivery event. The psychiatrist attached to the filing had 3 sessions of notes on Grace Holloway Bennett. Grace had never met this psychiatrist in her life. A judge had agreed to hold a hearing. Grace had 72 hours. She sat in her hospital room and read the filing twice. Read it a third time. Her lawyer was on the phone within the hour, voice carefully controlled in the way that lawyers get when they are trying not to say the words, "This is very bad," while clearly meaning exactly that. Derek had tried to murder Emma and Noah before they were born, and now a court was considering giving them to him. "He is using the system," Grace said, "the same way he uses everything, the same way he used me." Catastrophes 2 arrived 3 days later. Connor brought his 14 months of fraud documentation to the prosecutor's office on a Monday morning. He came back to the hospital at noon, looking like a man who had taken a significant blow and was still processing where it had landed. The prosecutor's office had a problem with the evidence chain. Derek's attorney had somehow obtained information about Connor's planned submission and had moved quickly through channels that suggested a connection inside the DA's office. The documentation was not inadmissible, but its introduction would now require procedural steps that created delay, and delay in a criminal case with a defendant who was currently out on bail was a specific kind of danger. Connor sat in the parking garage for a long time before coming inside. Then he called his father, Theodore Hayes, retired federal judge, and said 4 words. "I waited too long," Theodore said. "Yes, you did. Now fix it." Connor came upstairs, told Grace exactly what had happened, did not soften it. She looked at him. "What do we do?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said. This, Grace would think later, was the moment she started trusting him. Not the rescue, not the terrible coffee. The moment he sat in her hospital room and admitted he did not have the answer and did not pretend otherwise. Catastrophe 3 arrived on a Wednesday night. Grace was attempting to sleep, which had not been going particularly well since the night she delivered 2 babies in a freezer, when her nurse, Jennifer, appeared in the doorway. Jennifer was young and competent and generally maintained a professional calm that Grace had come to find reassuring. She did not look calm now. A man matching Derek's description had been seen in the NICU hallway. The hospital reviewed the security footage. Derek Bennett had obtained a visitor badge under a false name. He had been in the building for 11 minutes, He had stood in the hallway outside the NICU. He had been 20 feet from Emma and Noah. Grace heard this information, sitting in her hospital bed, and felt something leave her body that she could not immediately name. Some last reserve of functioning equilibrium. She found the wall, pressed her back against it, slid down until she was sitting on the floor, which was not a thing she was supposed to do with her injuries and her healing and her everything, and she did not care. Claire sat down on the floor beside her without being asked. They sat there together. "He's going to finish what he started," Grace said, "and I cannot stop him." That night, at 3 in the morning, Grace wrote a letter. She addressed it to Emma and Noah. She told them who they were, what they had survived, what she had seen in their tiny faces in that frozen room. She told them who she hoped they would become. She described their father, their real father, the one they deserved, in terms of qualities rather than a name, because she did not know, yet, who that would be. She folded the letter, put it in the drawer beside her bed, just in case. Then she opened the drawer again, took it out, read it once more, folded it back up, put it in her purse instead, because just in case was not a plan. And Grace Holloway had decided, somewhere between reading it and folding it, that she was done waiting for someone else to make one. Grace made 3 phone calls on a Thursday morning. The first was to Miranda Calloway. Grace had found Miranda's name in a chain of emails from 4 years ago that she had stored and not examined and had always told herself meant nothing. Miranda had filed a police report 7 years earlier, then withdrawn it. The report was about Derek Bennett, about being confined against her will for 3 days in a locked apartment when she had tried to end their relationship. Grace dialed the number she had found through 3 degrees of searching and 1 helpful paralegal on her legal team. Miranda answered on the second ring. "I know who you are," Miranda said immediately. "I've been watching the news." "I'm not calling to ask you to be brave for me," Grace said. "I'm calling to ask you to be brave for the next woman. Because there will be a next woman. There always is with men like him, unless someone stops it." A silence stretched between them, long enough that Grace thought the call had dropped. Then Miranda said, "What do you need?" The second call was to 3 journalists simultaneously, a feat of telephone logistics that her lawyer later described as inadvisable and Grace described as necessary. She recorded a 47-minute video statement, raw, specific, chronological, every detail she could recall, every date she had written down, every incident she had explained away and should not have. "If something happens to me or my children," she said to the camera, "this is why." The video went online before Derek's legal team could move to stop it. 4.2 million views in 36 hours. The narrative Derek had been carefully constructing in press conferences began developing cracks. The third call was to Theodore Hayes, not Connor. "Theodore, your son has the evidence," Grace said when he answered. "The chain is compromised. You spent 30 years as a federal judge. Tell me another way in." A pause. "How did you get this number?" Theodore asked. "Connor left his phone unlocked on my bedside table," Grace said. "I'm resourceful." Another pause, then something that might have been a laugh. "You remind me of my late wife," Theodore said. "Was she also furious?" "Constantly," Theodore said. "It was her best quality. Come meet me tomorrow. Bring everything you have." Grace went to that meeting in a wheelchair with a legal pad and 3 hours of energy she did not have, and she sat across from a 70-year-old retired federal judge and laid out everything she knew about Derek Bennett's financial crimes in the precise, organized way that 6 years of marketing work had trained her to organize information. Theodore listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You didn't need me to tell you what to do," he said. You already knew. I needed someone to tell me the door was there, Grace said. Theodore nodded slowly. The door is there. There is something that happens to people who have spent years in a relationship where their instincts are constantly questioned and their perceptions are constantly corrected. Some part of them starts to distrust themselves so thoroughly that they need external confirmation of things they already know. They need someone to say, yes, you are seeing this correctly, before they can act on what they see. Grace had spent 5 years being told she was too sensitive, too dramatic, too emotional, too much. She had started to believe it. She was done believing it. Document everything. Write down the dates, the times, the exact words. Not because you will use it all, but because the act of documenting forces you to see the pattern clearly. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. That clarity is the beginning of every exit. Grace could see the pattern. She had been seeing it for months. She had finally stopped looking away. The trial began on a Monday in February. Grace wore a navy suit that Claire had helped her choose. Conservative, precise, the kind of outfit that communicates credibility without asking for it. She walked into the courtroom on a foot that still ached where 3 toes used to be, and she sat at the prosecution table and did not look at Derek until she was ready. When she did look, she found the face she had expected, the composed, wounded expression of a man who had practiced grief until it fit him perfectly. The image of someone wrongly accused, devastated, confused by the cruelty being done to him. Grace had seen that face across 1,000 dinner tables. She knew every note of it. It did not move her anymore. The first 3 days of testimony built the prosecution's case with the methodical precision of a structure being assembled piece by piece. Security footage, keycard logs, timeline documentation that placed Derek in the building, in the freezer, and driving away within 20 minutes of Grace's arrival. Dr. Matthews described Grace's injuries in medical language that visibly affected several members of the jury. Miranda Calloway testified about the locked apartment 7 years earlier, her withdrawn report, her years of silence, and the decision she had made when she watched the news on a Tuesday morning and understood that silence had consequences. Derek's attorney cross-examined each witness with the aggressive confidence of someone billing a significant hourly rate. He was good. He was not good enough. Then the prosecution called Grace. She had practiced this. She had sat in conference rooms with Connor's attorneys and answered variations of every possible question until the answers were as natural as breathing. She had been told to stay calm, to stay factual, to not perform emotion, but to let it exist when it existed. She walked to the stand. She told the truth, all of it. The phone call, the empty building, the freezer, Derek's voice through the intercom, calm and rehearsed and almost gentle, explaining why she was going to die. The 10 hours, the labor, the birth, Emma's first cry, Noah's thin, reedy gasp, the letter she had written at 3 in the morning. Her voice did not shake. She had promised herself it would not shake. She kept that promise. The defense attorney's cross-examination was one of the more concentrated exercises in attempted reality distortion that Grace had ever experienced, which was saying something given her last 5 years. He questioned her memory. He questioned her emotional stability. He suggested that pregnancy had affected her perceptions. He implied that a woman who stayed in a difficult marriage for 5 years was not a credible narrator of that marriage. Grace answered every question, calmly, precisely, without anger and without performance. The attorney changed tactics. Was it not true that Grace stood to gain significantly from these accusations? Sympathy, support, financial resources? I stand to gain my life, Grace said. And my children's lives. and freedom from a man who tried to murder us. That's what I stand to gain." The attorney had nothing. Then came the moment no one predicted. The defense called Miranda Calloway back to the stand. Not as a prosecution witness this time. The defense attorney had prepared a redirect, a carefully structured series of questions designed to undermine Miranda's earlier testimony, to suggest inconsistency, to plant doubt. Miranda took the stand. The attorney began his questions. Miranda looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to the jury. "I can't do this," she said. "I need to tell the truth." The courtroom went very quiet. Miranda explained clearly, specifically, and with the particular authority of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally put it down, that Derek's legal team had contacted her 3 weeks ago, that she had been offered $10,000 to testify to his character, that she had agreed because she was frightened, that she was no longer frightened enough to stay quiet. "He did the same thing to me," Miranda said, 7 years ago. "He locked me in a basement apartment for 3 days when I tried to leave him. I was too scared to press charges. I withdrew my report, and I have lived with that decision every day since, because I know that my silence gave him more time, more women, more chances." The defense attorney was on his feet. The judge was calling for order. In the gallery, Grace sat perfectly still. She was looking at Miranda Calloway, a woman she had never met, a woman who had been too frightened to speak for 7 years, and had finally, in this moment, found that fear was not the largest thing inside her. After the recess, after the procedural chaos settled, after the judge ruled on what could and could not be used going forward, the defense rested with the quiet efficiency of people who knew they had lost. Closing arguments, deliberation, 6 hours. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty. 3 counts, all 3. Grace heard the word the first time, and her body did not know what to do with it. She sat very still while Claire pressed both hands over her mouth beside her, and the prosecution team exchanged the restrained satisfaction of people who have prepared for a long time for a single moment. She looked across the room. Connor was standing in the gallery. He mouthed 2 words. "It's done." Grace nodded once. It was done. Winning did not feel the way she had imagined it would. There was no explosion of relief, no cinematic moment of collapse and tears. There was something quieter, a door closing, a weight she had been carrying for 5 years, and longer if she was honest, being set down with a finality she could feel in her chest. Derek would spend the rest of his life in prison. Her babies were safe. Everything else was details. The apartment was small, and Grace had chosen it herself. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that got morning light, a backyard that was technically a shared yard with the unit below, but had a corner that was effectively hers, where she put a chair and a small table and a plant that she kept alive through sheer determination, because keeping things alive had become personally important to her. Connor had covered the first 6 months of rent. Grace had made him put it in writing as a loan, which he had found unnecessary and she had found essential because financial independence was not a concept she was willing to treat as optional ever again. She had been in this apartment for 3 weeks when she realized she had checked the locks 6 times before bed. She counted carefully the next night. 4 times. The night after. 3. Progress came in the form of numbers going down. It was not glamorous progress. It did not look like a montage. It looked like a woman sitting on the edge of her bed at midnight doing arithmetic and deciding that 4 was better than 6 and 3 would eventually be better than 4. Her therapist was named Dr. Sandra Okafor, and she was excellent, and therapy was hard. Not hard in the way that dramatic depictions of therapy are hard, with sudden breakthroughs and cathartic moments of revelation. Hard in the way that examining the inside of something complicated is always hard. Slow, careful sometimes, tedious, and consistently necessary, Connor came over on Tuesday evenings. He had suggested Tuesdays, because Tuesdays were nobody's favorite day, and showing up on a bad day was more useful than showing up on a good one. He brought dinner, usually Thai food, which was Grace's favorite in a way she had not realized she still had until the smell of Pad CU from the front door started making her genuinely happy rather than just neutral. One Tuesday, he arrived to help assemble a crib that Emma and Noah would eventually need when they graduated from the bassinets. The crib came in 47 pieces, with instructions that appeared to have been translated from Swedish by someone who was not entirely confident in either language. 2 hours later, they were sitting on the floor surrounded by crib components, neither of them any closer to understanding Step 7, which seemed to require a tool the kit had not included. "I have a technology company," Connor said. 400 employees. We build things. "And yet," Grace said, "and yet." He held up the instruction booklet. "I think this is a diagram of a different crib." "I think you're right." They looked at each other. They started laughing at approximately the same moment, the kind of laughing that makes your ribs hurt, that spills over into the ridiculous, that leaves you sitting on the floor at 9:30 p.m., surrounded by hardware you do not understand, and somehow that is the best you have felt in months. Grace went back to work in month 4, freelance marketing, consulting, her own clients, her own hours, her own money deposited into a bank account that had only her name on it. The first time she made a client presentation that resulted in a signed contract, she sat in her car in the parking lot afterward for 10 minutes doing nothing in particular. She had done that herself. With her skills, her ideas, her work, it was such a small thing. It was enormous. Connor confessed about the delayed evidence one evening in month 5, not the version he had told her in the hospital, the factual accounting, the real version, the one where he admitted that part of his motivation for building a private civil case, rather than reporting Derek's fraud immediately, had been about control, about wanting to be the one who brought Derek down on his own terms in his own time, that the justice had felt secondary to the specific satisfaction of the confrontation. "I told myself it was about building an airtight case," Connor said, "and that was part of it, but not all of it." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Holding two true things at once," she said. "The airtight case was real, and the revenge was real. Both things were true." Connor looked at her. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Hold things that contradict each other. Practice," Grace said. "Terrible, painful practice. Also therapy. I cannot recommend therapy enough." He started seeing a therapist the following week. At Grace's suggestion, not his own idea, he came back from the first session looking like a man who had discovered a room in his house he had not known existed and was not entirely sure what to do with the furniture inside. It was uncomfortable, he reported. "It is supposed to be," Grace said. "Is it always this uncomfortable?" "It gets differently uncomfortable," Grace said, which is its own kind of progress. Rebuilding after trauma is not linear. There will be good weeks and terrible Tuesdays, which in Grace's case had become her best day, because Connor came on Tuesdays with Thai food and a willingness to sit on her floor for 2 hours failing to assemble furniture. The goal is not to never struggle. The goal is to struggle with people beside you rather than alone. That difference between private struggle and witness struggle, between carrying weight in secret and carrying it alongside someone who knows how heavy it is, that difference is everything. Grace was learning the difference, one breath at a time, one Tuesday at a time, one lock check fewer each week than the week before. Emma and Noah's first birthday fell on a Saturday in November. A year, almost to the day, since a freezer in Stamford had tried to end all three of their lives. Grace made a small party. Backyard, afternoon light, Claire and Megan and Theodore and a handful of people who had earned the right to be there. Emma ate her birthday cupcake with the focused, joyful demolition of someone encountering the concept of frosting for the first time and finding it to be the most important discovery in human history. Noah ate approximately 3 bites of his and then fell asleep with his face on the tray of his high chair in the complete and unselfconscious way that only babies and people at peace with themselves can sleep. After everyone had gone inside, after the kids were down, after the backyard was just Grace and Connor, and the particular quiet of a late autumn evening, Connor sat next to her on the porch steps. He did not have a prepared speech. She could tell that he had thought about having one and then decided against it, which told her something important about how well he had come to know her. "I'm not going to tell you I saved you," he said. "We both know that's not true. And I'm not going to tell you I'm perfect because you've seen me attempt IKEA furniture and you have first-hand evidence to the contrary." Grace laughed. "I want to marry you," Connor said. "Not because you need me. You've been very clear that you don't. But because you're the most honest person I have ever known, and I would like to spend the rest of my life around someone who tells the truth even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Grace looked at him. "That might be the least romantic proposal in the history of Connecticut," she said. "I have many flaws." "I know." A pause. "I'm saying yes, anyway." The wedding was small, 40 people. A Saturday morning in May with good light. Grace wore yellow. Derek had always said yellow washed her out. Derek had said it so many times that she had stopped buying yellow things, had let the color quietly exit her wardrobe, the way so many small pieces of herself had quietly exited her life during those 5 years. She had not noticed until she was standing in a boutique with Claire 6 weeks before the wedding and saw a dress in the precise shade of warm gold that she had loved as a child. And her first thought was, Derek doesn't like yellow. And her second thought was that Derek was serving 3 consecutive life sentences and had no further opinions that she was required to consider. She bought the dress. She wore it. She looked, Claire said, like someone who had remembered something important. The ceremony was simple. Vows they had written themselves. Theodore gave a toast that made every woman in the room cry, and several of the men pretend they were not. Connor said his vows, without notes, looking at Grace the way she had only seen people look at things they were genuinely afraid of losing. The look that is more honest than any rehearsed declaration, because it cannot be faked. Midway through Grace's vows, Emma, who had been sitting in the front row with Megan being bribed with crackers to remain stationary, looked up at Connor and said with complete clarity and no particular sense of occasion, "Dada." Grace stopped speaking. Connor appeared to briefly forget how to breathe. The officiant waited with professional patience. Grace wiped her eyes, started laughing. Finished her vows with the particular grace of someone who has learned that the best moments are always the ones you could not have planned. They were pronounced married to a room full of people who had witnessed the hard version of the story and were therefore uniquely qualified to understand what the happy version meant. Derek filed his 4th appeal 6 months after the wedding. Wrongful conviction, new evidence, judicial error. The appeal was denied in writing within 3 weeks. The judge's response was, by legal standards, notably brief. Patricia Bennett sent a handwritten letter on cream stationery with a monogram in the upper left corner. Grace read it twice. It said things that were true and things that were too late and things that would have meant something in a different order than they arrived. Patricia had known her son had a problem. She had made excuses. She was sorry. Grace put the letter in a drawer. She did not respond. That silence was its own kind of answer. The answer that said, I receive this, but I owe you nothing, not forgiveness, not acknowledgement, not the continued investment of my energy in your guilt. You will have to carry that yourself. Some people will never believe you. Some people will choose the story that is more comfortable than the truth. You do not have to convince them. You do not have to keep trying. The moment you stop needing them to understand is the moment they lose the ability to hurt you. Grace stopped needing. It was quieter than she expected. Emma and Noah were 2 when Connor formally adopted them. The paperwork was completed on a Tuesday, which was already their best day, and they celebrated with Thai food on the kitchen floor because the table was currently occupied by a train set that Noah had distributed across every horizontal surface in the apartment with the thoroughness of a very small urban planner. They called him Dada. They had been calling him Dada for months. The legal reality caught up to what was already true. Derek Bennett received no visitors in prison. He had filed for contact with his biological children twice. Both petitions had been denied. He had no relationship with Emma and Noah. He never would. He was a footnote, a warning, a cautionary tale told in the conditional tense. What happens when someone mistakes control for love and calculation for connection and another person's life for a resource to be managed? He was not a chapter in Grace's story anymore. He was a sentence in an early chapter, a sentence that explained what came after. One evening, when Emma and Noah were 3, Grace sat on the back porch in the chair she had placed in the good corner of the yard, and she listened to Connor inside reading to the twins. He was doing the voices, extravagant, ridiculous voices, a different voice for every character, with sound effects that she could hear even through the closed back door, and the sound of 2 3-year-olds laughing with the whole body abandon of children who have never had reason to be afraid. Grace checked her phone. Once, she set it down. She looked at the backyard, the plant she had kept alive, the good corner, the chair she had chosen herself. She thought about a woman in a negative 50-degree freezer, 8 months pregnant, alone, counting her own breaths to stay awake. That woman had not known she would be here, had not known there was a here to arrive at, had thought, in the last clear moment before her eyes closed, that she was saying goodbye. She was not saying goodbye. She was saying, not yet, not here, not like this. She was saying, I am tougher than anyone suspected, tougher than I suspected. She was saying, my babies are not dying in here. They had not. She had not. You don't have to forgive to be free. Forgiveness is for you, and only if and when it is ready to arrive, and no one can schedule its arrival. What you owe no one is your continued suffering. Leaving is not betrayal. Healing is not disloyalty. Thriving is not revenge. It is simply your life, finally returned to you, finally yours to fill with yellow dresses and terrible coffee and Tuesday evenings and extravagant voices reading bedtime stories to children who have never had reason to be afraid. Grace Morrison Hayes was 4 years out from the freezer. She was, actually, genuinely, completely happy. The back door opened. Connor appeared with 2 cups of tea. Good tea because he had eventually learned. He sat down in the chair beside hers. They sat in the November evening, the same month, almost the same week, that a parking lot hazard light had blinked for 6 hours until someone decided it was his problem. What are you thinking? Connor asked. Grace considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything now. That Derek thought cold would kill me, she said, and instead it showed me exactly how much heat I had left. Connor looked at her. Best revenge story ever, he said. It's not revenge, Grace said. Revenge would mean I still thought about him. I don't. This is just my life. She reached over and took his hand. Our life, she said. and it's a very good one. Inside, Emma and Noah were still laughing. The plant in the corner of the yard was still alive. The locks, when she checked them later, she checked only once. Progress. If Grace's story moved you today, if it gave you something, whether that is courage, clarity, comfort, or simply the reminder that people can survive the impossible and still choose joy, we would love to hear from you. Leave us a comment below. Tell us which moment stayed with you. Tell us your own story if you are ready. Or simply say hello, because every person who finds this channel deserves to know, no, they are not alone in whatever they are carrying. If you believe stories like this one deserve to be heard, please hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells us that this kind of storytelling matters to you. Share this video with someone in your life who needs it right now. You may not know exactly who that person is. Share it anyway. The right story finds the right person at the right time, and your share might be the moment someone realizes their story does not have to end where they are standing. And if you are new here, subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you stories of ordinary people who survived extraordinary circumstances. Stories of courage, of justice, of love that arrives late and stays forever. Stories that remind us what human beings are capable of when they refuse to give up. Grace did not need saving. She needed someone to open the door. Be that person for someone today. We will see you in the next story. Closing statement. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team, crafted with intention to bring you not just a story, but a truth worth carrying.